What if one announcement could end one of the world's longest and bloodiest conflicts, or ignite an even bigger one? What if the group that has fought Israel for decades suddenly agreed to lay down its weapons? And what if the man claiming this breakthrough wasn't a Middle Eastern leader, but the President of the United States? For years, the world has watched Gaza become one of the most dangerous places on earth. Entire neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble. Thousands of lives have been lost. Every ceasefire has seemed temporary. Every peace effort has eventually collapsed. Then suddenly a headline appeared that caught the world's attention. Donald Trump claimed that a breakthrough had finally been reached, a deal that could lead to the disarmament of Hamas. If true, it would mark one of the most dramatic turning points in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But almost immediately, questions began to emerge. Did Hamas really agree to disarm? Or was there far more hidden beneath the headline? Because in conflicts like this, public announcements rarely tell the entire story. Behind every handshake lies months of secret negotiations. Behind every agreement lies conditions that may never be fully revealed. And behind every promise lies one question that history has asked over and over again. Can anyone truly bring peace to Gaza? This isn't simply about weapons. It isn't only about Hamas. It isn't even only about Israel. This is a story about power, influence, strategy, regional alliances, and decisions made in closed rooms, far away from the battlefields, that can reshape the lives of millions. Because while cameras focused on explosions, diplomats were holding conversations behind closed doors. While soldiers fought on the ground, negotiators were trying to stop a war that had already changed the Middle East. And while the public debated headlines, governments were calculating something much bigger than a ceasefire. They were calculating the future balance of power across the region. That is what makes this moment so important. Because if this agreement succeeds, it could fundamentally change who governs Gaza, how security is maintained, and how neighboring countries approach one of the region's most enduring conflicts. But if it fails, the consequences could be felt far beyond Gaza, from Israel to Lebanon, to Syria, to Iran, and even Washington. Yet there is another mystery. If negotiations had been taking place for months, why did this announcement happen now? Why this week? Why this moment? And why were officials from multiple countries suddenly involved at the same time? Those questions lead us to an even bigger mystery, because reports suggest this wasn't simply a ceasefire proposal. It was part of a much broader framework involving security arrangements, governance, international oversight, and the future political structure of Gaza. If that's true, then this isn't just another peace negotiation. It's an attempt to redesign what comes after the war. But before we can understand the agreement, we first have to understand how the region reached this point. Because today's negotiations were shaped by years of conflict, failed diplomacy, military operations, shifting alliances, and decisions that changed the Middle East forever. Only by going back can we understand why the current proposal exists, and why so many people remain skeptical that it will ever be fully implemented. In the next chapter, we'll trace the road that led to this moment, from the outbreak of war to the diplomatic pressure that made negotiations possible. And we'll uncover why both sides eventually found themselves facing choices they had tried to avoid for years. Chapter 1. The Road to the Negotiating Table. Every major peace proposal begins long before diplomats sit around a table. It begins on the battlefield, and the road to the latest negotiations was shaped by years of violence, political deadlock, and repeated attempts at ceasefires that ultimately broke down. For decades, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has remained one of the world's most difficult and emotionally charged disputes. Gaza, a densely populated coastal territory, has been at the center of many of those confrontations. Over the years, cycles of rocket attacks, military operations, and ceasefire agreements have repeatedly begun and repeatedly unraveled. Each new round of fighting left deeper scars than the one before. Homes were destroyed, infrastructure was damaged, families were displaced, trust, already fragile, became even harder to rebuild. As the conflict intensified over time, international pressure also grew. Governments around the world, regional mediators, and humanitarian organizations increasingly called for an end to the fighting. Countries such as Qatar and Egypt frequently acted as intermediaries, While the United States remained deeply involved in diplomatic efforts because of its close relationship with Israel and its broader strategic interests in the Middle East. Yet every proposal faced the same fundamental problem. The two sides were not only fighting over territory, they held profoundly different views about security, governance, recognition, and the future political structure of Gaza. That made every negotiation extraordinarily difficult, because even if the guns fell silent, the underlying disagreements remained. And that brings us to another crucial question. If so many ceasefire efforts had failed before, what made this latest diplomatic push different? The answer wasn't found only in Gaza. It was found across the wider Middle East. Regional dynamics were changing. Several governments had growing concerns that continued instability could spill beyond Gaza's borders. Diplomatic pressure increased to prevent a broader regional escalation, while humanitarian conditions added urgency to finding at least a temporary framework for reducing violence. At the same time, political leaders were facing pressure at home. Military operations are costly. Long conflicts strain economies. They affect public opinion. They reshape alliances. And eventually, every government must decide whether continuing the conflict serves its long-term interests. That doesn't automatically produce peace, but it can create space for negotiations that previously seemed impossible. Still, negotiations require more than pressure. They require someone willing to carry messages between sides that are not speaking directly. And that is where another group quietly entered the story. Diplomats, intelligence officials, regional mediators, people working largely away from television cameras. Their meetings rarely made headlines, but without them, there would have been no announcement to discuss today. Yet an even bigger mystery remained hidden, because while the world focused on military developments, a separate diplomatic process was slowly taking shape behind closed doors. Who was talking? What proposals were being exchanged? And what conditions were being demanded before any agreement could move forward? Those answers remain largely invisible to the public, until now. Because the next chapter takes us inside the quiet diplomacy that unfolded far from the battlefield. It reveals the countries that acted as intermediaries, the competing interests at the negotiating table, and the difficult compromises that reportedly form the foundation of the current framework. And once those negotiations are revealed, you'll understand why many experts say the hardest part of this process hasn't happened yet. It may only be beginning. Chapter 2. The Diplomacy. No one could see while television cameras followed explosions. Another battle was unfolding hundreds of miles away. Not with missiles, not with fighter jets, but with words. Because in modern conflicts, some of the most important victories are achieved in rooms the public never sees. For months, officials from multiple countries were engaged in quiet diplomacy. The meetings rarely appeared on front pages. The participants often arrived without media attention, and almost every conversation remained confidential. Why? Because successful negotiations rarely happen under bright lights. Every public statement can harden positions. Every leaked proposal can trigger political backlash. Every misunderstood sentence can destroy months of progress. That is why the most delicate discussions often happen behind closed doors. At the center of these efforts were regional mediators, particularly Qatar and Egypt, countries that have repeatedly helped facilitate indirect talks during previous Gaza crises. The United States also remained deeply involved, using its diplomatic influence to encourage movement toward a broader framework. But bringing everyone to the table was only the beginning. The real challenge was something far more complicated. Each side entered the negotiations with very different priorities. Israel's primary objective was security. Its leadership argued that any lasting arrangement would have to prevent future attacks and reduce the military capabilities of armed groups operating in Gaza. For Hamas, however, the priorities were different. Reports indicated that discussions centered on issues such as military operations, humanitarian access, governance, reconstruction, and the future status of Gaza. These were not simple bargaining points. They were questions that would shape the future of millions of people. And that's what made every meeting so difficult. Imagine trying to solve a puzzle where every piece changes the shape of another. If one side accepted a condition, another condition immediately became more complicated. If one issue appeared resolved, 3 more disagreements emerged. Progress was measured not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in tiny steps. One proposal, one revision, one conversation at a time. Yet behind all these discussions was a question that almost no one outside the negotiating rooms could answer. What exactly would disarmament mean? Would it happen immediately? Would it happen in stages? Who would verify it? Who would enforce it? And perhaps the biggest question of all, who would govern Gaza afterward? Because removing weapons is one challenge. Building a stable political future is an entirely different one. History has shown that ending active fighting does not automatically produce lasting peace. Without institutions, without security arrangements, without public confidence, even carefully negotiated agreements can unravel. That is why many diplomats reportedly viewed governance, not disarmament, as one of the most difficult parts of the discussions. And then, something unexpected happened. After months of careful negotiations, a public announcement suddenly changed everything. The world woke up to headlines claiming that a breakthrough had finally been reached. Supporters called it historic. Critics urged caution. Analysts immediately began asking the same question. Was this truly a diplomatic turning point? Or was it only the beginning of another long and uncertain chapter? Because one announcement cannot guarantee success, it can only begin a new phase. And the moment that announcement was made, the pressure on every side increased dramatically. The world was now watching. Every statement mattered. Every reaction mattered. Every delay mattered. But one mystery still remained unanswered. Why did President Trump decide that this was the right moment to make such a significant announcement? Was it simply because negotiators had reached enough progress to speak publicly? Or were there broader political and strategic reasons behind the timing? That question takes us into the next chapter, because understanding when an announcement is made can be just as important as understanding what the announcement says. Chapter 3, the statement that changed the conversation. There are moments in international politics when a single sentence changes the direction of the conversation. Not because a war has ended, not because every side has signed an agreement, but because the world suddenly begins asking a different question. Instead of asking, will this war continue? People begin asking, could this finally be the beginning of the end? That is exactly what happened when President Donald Trump publicly claimed that negotiators had reached a breakthrough framework involving Gaza and the disarmament of Hamas. Within minutes, news organizations across the globe picked up the story. Governments began reviewing the reports. Analysts started examining every word. And social media exploded with one simple question. Was this real? At first glance, the announcement sounded historic. If implemented, it could represent one of the most significant diplomatic developments in the Gaza conflict in years. But experienced observers immediately noticed something important. The announcement described a proposed framework, not a completed peace treaty. That distinction matters. In diplomacy, a framework outlines the direction negotiators hope to take. It identifies areas of potential agreement. It creates a roadmap. But a roadmap is not the destination. Every stage still requires negotiation, verification, and political approval. And in conflicts as complex as this one, those steps can be just as difficult as reaching the initial understanding. That is why reactions from around the world were cautious. Some governments welcomed the possibility of reduced violence. Others emphasized that any agreement would ultimately depend on implementation. Military analysts warned that agreements involving security arrangements require careful verification. Humanitarian organizations expressed hope that progress could improve conditions for civilians affected by the conflict. Optimism existed, but so did skepticism, because history has created a painful lesson. The Middle East has seen hopeful announcements before. Some produced meaningful progress. Others collapsed before they were ever fully implemented. So experts began asking another question. What exactly had Hamas agreed to? Because headlines often simplify complex negotiations. The phrase disarmament deal sounds straightforward. The reality is rarely that simple. Reports suggested that discussions involved multiple interconnected issues: security, governance, humanitarian access, international oversight, future administration of Gaza. Each issue depended on progress in the others. Remove one piece, and the entire framework could become unstable. Then another layer of complexity emerged. Israel had not yet completed every political step required for full implementation. That meant negotiators still faced significant work before any long-term arrangement could move from paper to reality. And yet, despite all the uncertainty, one fact could not be ignored. The conversation itself had changed. For months, headlines had focused almost exclusively on military developments. Now, diplomacy had become the center of global attention. The battlefield was no longer the only place where the future of Gaza was being decided. Conference rooms, negotiating tables, and diplomatic channels had become equally important. But perhaps the biggest misunderstanding was this. Many people believed the hardest part was reaching an agreement. In reality, experienced negotiators often say the opposite. Reaching an agreement is difficult. Implementing it is even harder, because every promise must eventually become action. Weapons cannot simply disappear overnight. Political systems cannot be rebuilt in a single week. Trust cannot be restored through one announcement. And that's where the real challenge begins. Because if this framework moves forward, someone will have to answer one of the most difficult questions in modern Middle Eastern politics. Who governs Gaza after the fighting ends? That question has divided leaders for years. It has complicated nearly every diplomatic effort, and according to many analysts, it may determine whether this agreement succeeds or joins a long list of peace efforts that ultimately failed. The answer lies in the next chapter, because now we move beyond the headlines, beyond the speeches, and into the details of what has actually been reported about the proposed framework and why every single condition matters. Chapter 4. The agreement behind the headlines for days. One word dominated headlines across the world: disarmament. It sounded simple, almost absolute, as if one announcement had solved one of the most difficult security problems in the Middle East. But diplomacy rarely works that way, because behind every headline, there is a document. Behind every document, there are conditions. And behind every condition, there are political calculations that can determine whether an agreement survives or collapses. So, what was actually being discussed? According to public reporting at the time, negotiators were working on a proposed framework, not a finalized peace treaty. The framework reportedly linked several issues together, rather than treating them separately. The first issue was security. Israeli officials have consistently argued that any long-term arrangement must address the threat posed by armed groups operating in Gaza. From their perspective, a lasting agreement would require mechanisms that reduce the risk of future attacks. But security was only one piece of the puzzle. The second issue was the future governance of Gaza. If military operations eventually ended, who would be responsible for running hospitals? Who would pay teachers? Who would restore electricity and water systems? Who would oversee border crossings? And perhaps most importantly, who would be accepted by the people living there and by the international community? Those questions have no easy answers, because governing Gaza is not simply about politics. It is about rebuilding institutions after years of conflict. The third issue was humanitarian relief and reconstruction. Entire neighborhoods have been damaged during repeated rounds of fighting. Rebuilding homes, schools, roads, and essential infrastructure would require years of work and substantial international support. But reconstruction presents another challenge. Donor countries often want transparency and oversight over how funds are used. Local authorities want enough control to govern effectively. Balancing those interests is rarely straightforward. Then came perhaps the most sensitive subject of all: weapons. The phrase disarmament can mean different things in different negotiations. Would weapons be surrendered immediately? Would the process happen in stages? Would an international body verify compliance? Would implementation depend on other commitments, such as military withdrawals or governance arrangements? These were precisely the kinds of questions negotiators were trying to resolve. And because the discussions reportedly linked multiple issues together, progress in one area depended on progress in another. That meant the framework functioned like a chain. If one link broke, the entire agreement could come under pressure, which explains why experienced diplomats remain cautious. They understood that announcing a framework is one milestone. Carrying it out is another. History offers many examples where promising agreements stalled during implementation, sometimes because of political disagreements, sometimes because of security concerns, sometimes because events on the ground changed faster than negotiators could respond. And that's why, Even as headlines spoke of a breakthrough, many analysts warned that the most difficult phase still lay ahead. But there was another question, one that reached far beyond Gaza itself. Because conflicts in the Middle East rarely affect only one territory. Regional powers were watching every development closely. Some supported diplomatic progress. Others worried about how a new balance of power might affect their own strategic interests. If the framework moved forward, it would not only influence Gaza, it could reshape relationships across the wider region. And that's where our story takes an even more complicated turn. Because while the world focused on the agreement itself, another battle was quietly unfolding. Not on the streets of Gaza, not inside Israel, but in the calculations of governments across the Middle East, each one asking the same question. If this agreement succeeds, who gains the most influence? And perhaps even more importantly, who stands to lose it? Those answers may determine whether this framework has a realistic chance of lasting or whether it becomes another chapter in the long history of unrealized peace efforts. Chapter 5. Why peace is often harder than war. If you've watched this story unfold from the beginning, you might think the hardest part was convincing the two sides to talk. It wasn't. The hardest part comes after the cameras leave, because history has taught one painful lesson. Signing an agreement is difficult. Keeping it alive is even harder. In nearly every major conflict, peace doesn't collapse overnight. It collapses one disagreement, one delay, one misunderstanding at a time. And that's exactly why many diplomats remain cautious, even after reports of a breakthrough framework. Because the document itself wasn't the finish line. It was the starting point. Imagine trying to build a bridge while people are still arguing over which side of the river it should connect. That's the challenge facing negotiators. Every commitment depends on another commitment. Every promise depends on trust. And trust is the one thing this conflict has lacked for decades. For Israel, the central concern remains security. Israeli leaders have repeatedly stated that any long-term arrangement must prevent future attacks and ensure that armed groups cannot rebuild military capabilities. From that perspective, security guarantees are not optional. They are essential. But on the other side, any long-term arrangement also raises difficult political questions about governance, reconstruction, movement of people and goods, and the future administration of Gaza. Those issues cannot be solved by military force alone. They require political agreements, international support, and time. Lots of time. Then there's another challenge that rarely appears in headlines. Even if senior negotiators reach an understanding, implementing it requires cooperation from many different institutions and stakeholders. Military officials, civil administrators, international organizations, regional mediators. Each has its own responsibilities. Each has its own concerns. And each delay can affect the entire process. But the obstacles don't end there, because the Middle East is one of the world's most strategically interconnected regions. What happens in Gaza rarely stays in Gaza. Neighboring countries monitor every development. Regional alliances influence diplomatic decisions. Global powers also have interests tied to regional stability, energy security, and international diplomacy. That means a proposal isn't judged only by the parties directly involved. It is also viewed through the strategic calculations of governments across the region and beyond. And that's where the story becomes even more complicated, because peace agreements are not judged only by what they promise. They're judged by what they change. If this framework succeeds, the political landscape of Gaza could look very different. Regional diplomacy could shift. Security arrangements could evolve. But if it fails, the consequences could reach far beyond the negotiating table. Renewed fighting, greater regional tension, another cycle of instability. No one involved wants that outcome, yet everyone understands it remains a possibility. Which brings us to the biggest unanswered question of this entire documentary. If so many risks remain, why did negotiators believe this moment was different from the many attempts that came before? Was there a new strategic reality, a new diplomatic opportunity, or had the costs of continuing the conflict simply become too high for everyone involved? That question has been quietly sitting beneath every chapter of this story, and in the next part, we'll begin answering it. We'll step back from the daily headlines and examine the broader geopolitical picture. why governments across the region are watching so closely what each side stands to gain or lose, and why this proposed framework carries implications far beyond Gaza itself. Only then will we reach the documentary's final chapter, where all of the major open loops come together. Chapter 6, The Real Stakes. Go beyond Gaza. For most people, this story is about Gaza, about Israel, about Hamas. But for governments across the Middle East, the stakes are much larger, because every major conflict creates a question that goes far beyond the battlefield. Who will shape the region after the fighting stops? That question has quietly influenced almost every diplomatic move you've heard about in this documentary. And once you understand that, the headlines begin to look very different. Think about it. If a lasting agreement eventually takes hold, it wouldn't simply reduce violence. It could also change how regional powers interact with one another. New diplomatic relationships could emerge. Existing alliances could strengthen or come under new pressure. International investment and reconstruction could reshape Gaza's future. And countries that help mediate the negotiations could gain greater diplomatic influence. That's why so many governments have followed these talks so closely, not because every country has the same goals, but because every country has something at stake. Some are primarily focused on regional stability. Others are concerned about security. Others see diplomatic opportunities. And global powers, including the United States, also view the Middle East through broader strategic lenses that extend beyond a single conflict. That means this isn't just a local story. It's part of a much larger geopolitical picture. But here's something that often gets lost in the headlines. Diplomacy is not about creating perfect outcomes. It's about finding outcomes that enough parties are willing to accept. Sometimes, no one leaves completely satisfied. Yet everyone believes the alternative is worse. That is often how difficult negotiations move forward. And that's why the reported framework attracted so much attention. Not because it promised perfection, but because it suggested that key players might have found enough common ground to continue talking. Still, one major obstacle remains: public expectations. The moment leaders announce a possible breakthrough, people expect results immediately. But rebuilding trust after years of conflict doesn't happen overnight. Political agreements require implementation. Implementation requires coordination. Coordination requires patience. And patience is often the first casualty of prolonged conflict. That brings us back to the biggest question we've carried since the opening minutes of this documentary. Was this announcement truly the beginning of a historic breakthrough? Or simply another hopeful moment that history may judge differently? The answer isn't found in a single speech, or one headline, or one diplomatic meeting. It's found in what happens next. Will commitments be carried out? Will security arrangements hold? Will governance questions be resolved? Will reconstruction begin? Those are the tests that will ultimately determine whether this moment becomes a turning point or another missed opportunity. And now, we've reached the final open loop, the one we've been building toward from the very beginning. Why did this announcement capture the world's attention? Was it because peace had finally arrived? Or because, for the first time in a long time, there appeared to be a framework that could move discussions beyond the battlefield, even though enormous challenges still remained? The final chapter isn't about choosing optimism or pessimism. It's about separating what has been confirmed from what remains uncertain, because in conflicts like this, the truth is often more complex than either side's headlines, and that's where our story ends. In the final chapter, we'll bring every thread together, reveal the answer to the documentary's biggest question, and explain why the future of this framework depends not on one announcement, but on what happens after the cameras are gone. Chapter 7. The moment history will remember. History rarely changes because of a single announcement. It changes because of what happens after the announcement. That is the answer we've been searching for since the opening seconds of this documentary. When President Donald Trump announced that negotiators had reached a breakthrough framework involving Gaza and the possible disarmament of Hamas, many people believed history had already been made. Others dismissed it immediately. But both reactions missed something important, because the real story was never the announcement itself. The real story was the possibility that years of military confrontation had created enough pressure for another serious diplomatic effort to emerge. Whether that effort ultimately succeeds or fails cannot be determined by one speech, only by what follows. Let's return to the questions we asked at the very beginning. Did Hamas really agree to disarm? Public reporting indicates that negotiators discussed a framework that included security-related measures linked to broader political and humanitarian conditions. However, the precise terms, sequencing, verification mechanisms, and final commitments remain subject to negotiation and implementation. Headlines often simplify what, in reality, is a highly conditional diplomatic process. In other words, the discussion wasn't simply about handing over weapons. It was about an entire political framework. Why did President Trump announce it? Because diplomacy often requires public momentum. When negotiators believe meaningful progress has been made, leaders sometimes choose to announce that progress to build international support and encourage the next phase of negotiations. But announcements can also raise expectations, and high expectations create high pressure. From that moment forward, every delay, every disagreement, every setback becomes international news. Who benefits if this framework succeeds? The answer is more complicated than it first appears. If violence decreases, civilians benefit first. If reconstruction begins, communities benefit. If regional tensions ease, neighboring countries benefit from greater stability. And if diplomacy continues, the broader international community gains a chance to reduce the risk of further escalation. But diplomacy rarely creates absolute winners. Every side makes compromises. Every side gives up something. That is why agreements of this scale are so difficult to achieve. And who could lose? Any stakeholder that believes its security, political influence, or strategic interests are weakened by the final outcome may view the agreement with caution or opposition. That doesn't automatically mean the framework will fail, but it does mean implementation will require sustained political commitment, not just one round of negotiations. Which brings us to the final open loop, the one we've carried through every chapter. Was this the beginning of peace, or merely another pause in a conflict that has defined generations? The honest answer is that no one can say with certainty today. History has seen promising agreements succeed. History has also seen promising agreements collapse. The difference has almost always been what happened after the signatures, after the speeches, after the headlines faded. Because peace isn't built in conference rooms alone. It's built through implementation, verification, political will, security arrangements, economic recovery, and perhaps most difficult of all, the slow rebuilding of trust. Trust cannot be negotiated into existence. It has to be earned, one decision at a time, one commitment at a time, one day at a time. That is why this moment matters. Not because it guarantees peace, not because it guarantees failure, but because it represents a crossroads. One path leads toward continued diplomacy, however difficult it may be. The other risks returning to the cycle that has repeated itself for decades. The choice does not belong to one leader, or one government, or one organization. It depends on the actions of many actors over months, and perhaps years. And that is the real story. Not the headline, not the announcement, but the long, uncertain journey that follows. Because history will not judge this moment by what was promised. It will judge it by what was achieved. And somewhere in Gaza tonight, far from the cameras, far from the podiums, far from the speeches, ordinary families are waiting. Not for another headline, but for something much simpler. A future where tomorrow is quieter than yesterday. Whether this framework becomes the first step toward that future, or another chapter in a long history of unrealized hopes, is a question that only time can answer. In war, every explosion makes the news, but in peace, it's often the quiet decisions, made behind closed doors and tested over time, that truly shape history. The world has heard the announcement. Now it waits for the outcome.